know that God is saying here that he is a jealous God. He's envious of anyone or anything, because everything and anything is his anyway. But when we look at it, he's not envious of these things, but he is a jealous God. This sort of confuses us because of our concept of how we see jealousy and envy, and sometimes we fuse the two, or we can mix the two. And the note that I wrote, that somebody had written, envy is wanting what someone else has. Jealousy is wanting what is rightly yours. And what we're seeing playing out here is that you might be envious, for instance, and I use this as a for instance, God would say, do not covet your neighbour's wife, for instance. Do not envy, do not be envious of your neighbour's wife. If somebody is looking into that, think, oh, I wish my wife was like this lady, or looked like this lady, or acted like this lady, there is a sort of envy that can creep in. The jealousy side of it is if somebody then was, my neighbour, for instance, was looking at my wife. My wife is my wife. She's been given to me by God who come together are one flesh. I am her protector. We're husband and wife. We're one. I am going to protect her. So if I see somebody else moving in or hitting upon her, I'm going to be jealous in that sense. So that will motivate me to move to protect what is mine and what I believe to be part of me. So we see that God in himself is jealous for who he is, for his name, for his reputation, for his people, and also for his word and over his word. And if we just move to, or turn to Exodus chapter 20, let me just read from where we have the Ten Commandments. So it's Exodus 20, we'll be looking at verses 5 and 6. This is God speaking. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So we are seeing what God is actually saying, that God is a God who is jealous for what he wants and what he owns, what he as claim for himself. And he won't allow people to behave in a manner that is like this world, because we know the world is against God, the world is against Christ. And it's the world that we're called to go in, to be in the world, but not of the world, to preach Jesus. And as I say, that will draw people and it will offend people as well. But we see that against those who defy him and don't trust in him and just trust in themselves, God will act. God is a jealous God. He is for what is his, and he demands exclusive rights, in a sense. He demands exclusive devotion to himself. So God is just in his judgment, including with all who oppose him in his kingdom. He will be just because that's who he is. He's a judicial God. He is patient, kind, and long-suffering, yes. We know, and we've read, and we've been reminded. But it's no reason to underestimate God or disbelieve his final judgment that will come. And one day we will all stand alone. So we, as individuals, choose, as the word tells us, life or death. We choose to believe or not. We choose blessings or curses. And we choose what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, what is light, what is dark. Verse 4 there, so he rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers of Bashan, Carmel wither, and the bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him, the hills melt, the earth heaves before him, and the world and all who dwell in it. So God is using nature, as God often does, and the elements and he still does today. I mean, we're looking at climate change, we're looking at all these things, there's various conspiracies. But even with the weather, people are really reading certain news items and following news streams about this, and all this we're all going to fry and bake to death in the next week with the heat, and God is in full control, and there's a lot of fear and scaremongering around, but we as believers just need to put our trust and faith in him, who controls the elements and controls all the weather conditions, the sea, all these, the climatic change that we see. Whatever is happening, however it appears to us, God is not taken by surprise by these things. As I say, he's sovereign. He knows what is there. He knows what is coming. So, he is patient, he's kind, he's long-suffering, and thank God he is. We often ourselves as believers, we experience that he is so full of love and grace and mercy. But as I say, we shouldn't underestimate his final judgment. God's people, we've experienced power and might, and people in the Word have still experienced his power and might. You think back to Exodus, and all the children of Israel on their exodus from captivity experienced still questioning God, losing faith. And it is a time, for us, as the end approaches, to draw closer to him than ever. We have the benefit and hindsight of the Word and the prophecies that we see, and we can so easily, in the comfort of our own seats, read, and everything is panned out there. But we're also a very blessed generation in many, many ways as well, with what we do have in the written Word. We see the bad news for many people seems to be good news at the moment, where the good news is the good news of Christ. And the good news for us is to be taken out there to the unrighteous. It's for us in how we live our lives and how we speak and who we are. So in this message, as I said before, there will be good news for the righteous, but there won't be such good news for the unrighteous. We are called to live righteous lives. We're called to live in that hope and expectation of him and his return. So also for people in all ages, this would apply to as well. So this proclamation is God's divine intervention to warn them of what is to come. So let me carry on in verse 7 and chapter 1. We changed tack slightly. Let's continue. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him, but with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of the adversaries, the enemies. He will pursue his enemies into darkness. What do you plot against the Lord? He will make a complete end. Trouble will not rise up a second time, for they are like entangled thorns, like drunkards as they drink. They are consumed like stubble, fully dried. From you came one who plotted evil against the Lord, a worthless counselor. So Nineveh would no longer be that sure, stable city that it once was, that people looked towards and revered and feared. Nineveh wouldn't be that iconic city that it once was. It would actually become a place that would be dispersed, and the people of the city would have to flee. So after Assyria destroyed many nations and took loot and took gold and everything else that they could when they would take these other cities over for spoils, the Nineveh would be actually itself one day be destroyed and would be taken over. And we see like these strong warriors that they produced would be as drunkards. They would, when they finally are attacked by the Babylonians, which we'll see later on, and finally have a taste of their own medicine or are completely taken out by them, it comes as a massive surprise, even though we see God's warning through his prophet. So Assyria the mighty, this mighty city, this city of blood, whose emblem was a lion. They had lions everywhere, would become like this toothless lion and of no effect. They would no longer be a threat to anyone or a terror. They were the ultimate terrorists as well. They would play on the terror thing as terrorists do, just to frighten the opposition into submission before they even had to lift a finger. So terrorists today still play that same tack, and we see it. We're seeing it at the moment all around. One day, they themselves, Nineveh, will feel the wrath of terror for themselves. Maybe for many of them, for the first time, they would feel this real fear and terror for them. So this would be all carried out in God's judgment, and it is real vivid pictures of how things will become tangled like thorns, and as I say, they will be acting like drunken people when they're taken by surprise, and the city would be breached. So we see, as far as they were concerned, they were about to experience the full wrath of God. So let's pick it up in verse 12. Thus the Lord, though they are full in strength, and many will be cut down and pass away. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. And now I will break this yoke free from you and will burst your bonds apart. The Lord has been given commandment about you. No more shall your name be perpetuated. From the house of your gods I will cut off the carved images and the metal images. I will make your grave, for you are vile. Behold, upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace. Keeps your feast, O Judah, fulfills your vows, for never again shall the worthless pass through you. He is utterly cut off. It's quite sort of damning when we see the destruction of Nineveh and how it will take place, and its fall and how it will all happen. So, you know, this, as I say, going back in chapter 2, we see in verse 1 that the scatterers come against you, man the ramparts, watch the road, dress for battle, collect all your strength. For the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob, of Israel, as the majesty of Israel, for plunders have plundered them and ruined their branches. Now we see that this sarcastic words in some ways going on here to the people of Nineveh and their leaders to try and protect themselves from God's wrath, because they won't be able to protect themselves from the living God. But they will see, it will be seen by the believers, the restoration of Israel in future tense. Their ruin will not last forever, because they are God's chosen people, that God still has his hand upon them. Verse 3 in chapter 2, it's interesting, as I say, that the people who came to destroy Nineveh were dressed in scarlet, their sort of red scarlet uniforms. They also used to put blood upon their shields and weaponry. This was to bring fear to those who they came against, and it was one of their trademarks and something that they did, because they came from when the Babylonians came, and it was part of what they would bring with them to take over the city. So they themselves then would be bathed in their own blood. Their trustworthy chariots, their war machines, they would not prevail. So let's carry on in 2 from verse 3. The shield of his mighty men is red. His soldiers are clothed in scarlet. The chariots come with flashing metal on the day he musters them. The cypress spears are brandished. The chariots race madly through the streets. They rush to and fro through the squares. They gleam like torches. They dart like lightning. He remembers his officers as they stumble, as they go. They hasten to the wall. The siege tower is set up. The river gates are opened. The palace melts away. Its mistress is stripped. She is carried off. Her slave girls lamenting, moaning like doves, beating their breasts. So we see up to verse 7 that as I said, with their trusty chariots, their war machine, everything that they themselves relied on in their own war prowess as warriors, and all the kit that they would use to destroy these places would come against them, because obviously we will see that this mighty nation, the Babylonians, were brought in to bring that about. And it mentions in verse 6, after all verse 5, if we just go back slightly, he remembers his officers, they stumble as they go, they hasten to the wall, the siege tower is set up. All these commanders, and there's many of them, would be in disarray. They would be shocked, surprised. It would be incredulous for them to think that they were on the other end of what was going to be meted out, as they normally meted out evil upon, as an aggressor upon others that they overran. And then it mentions in verse 6, the river gates were opened, the palace melts away, its mistress is stripped, and she's carried off. Well, when the gates are opened, the water supply in those days came from conduits of water from the mountains to supply Nineveh for when it was a battle, when it was under siege, so they could last for many years. I had the privilege of visiting Israel. I know a few people have, and seeing the water cisterns there and the waterways, the underground waterways of what they could produce, many thousand years ago is incredible. And they're still unearthing some of them, but it would be by one of these very things of supplying water to keep them going that they would put a sluice gate in, the Babylonians, to actually stop the water and creep in the city and overrun it. And they would come in, literally themselves, forgive the pun, but like a flood. And they would come and take over the city. So verse 8, as we carry on, Nineveh is like a pool whose waters run away. Halt, halt, they cry, but none turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. There is no end of the treasure, of the wealth of all precious things. Desolation, desolation and ruin. Hearts melt and knees tremble. Anguish is in all loins. All faces grow pale. Where is the lion's den, the feeding place of the young lions, where the lions and the lionesses went, where her cubs were, with no one to disturb? The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lioness. He filled his caves with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Behold, verse 13, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke. The sword shall devour your young lions, or their warriors. I will cut off your prey, all their spoils from previous things, from the earth. From the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. They won't be taking counsel off anybody anymore, because they're going to be completely taken over and annihilated. And it's quite sort of damning as we see that Nineveh would no longer, as I say, be that sure, stable place that it was, and everything that they had all of a sudden would be returned and taken from them and carried out. So we see that they would no longer become a threat to anyone. Chapter 3, we see this going in now to the woe to the blood city, woe to Nineveh. Verse 1, woe to the blood city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey, the crack of the whip, the rumble of the wheel, galloping horses and bounding chariots, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over bodies and all the countless whorings of the prostitute, grateful of the deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and people with her charms, or peoples with her charms, sorry. So we see there in 3 that who can survive the Lord's opposition when it comes in like it does in this flood? This city was known also not only as a city of blood, but the mistress of sorcery, because of the magic arts that they would get involved with for the sacrifice and sacrifices they would make on behalf of their gods. Excuse me. And we see in that city there was much spiritual prostitution as well as prostitution, and it was all coming down. It was all coming to an end because of their pagan worship, turning their back on God and going back into pagan worship itself and sorcery once more. We see that in all of this, they would be totally humiliated, just like they humiliated other cities and other nations. They would do all sorts of heinous crimes to the kings, gouging out eyes, cutting off ears, feet and hands, and slow torture. It was all there for a fear factor, but it was very, very effective, and it was something they were very well known for. And as I said earlier, that's what brought a lot of fear to people, knowing what came with them. But in verse 5 we see, "Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will make nations look at your nakedness, and kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth at you and treat you with contempt, and make you a spectacle, and all who look at you will shrink from you and say, 'Wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you?'" Now, as far as that complete nakedness was always that picture of shaming somebody. We saw that Jesus, when we went to the cross, that was one of the things they did with the Roman crucifixions, was to completely strip people naked. Other nations would parade people naked. It was that complete... it wasn't so much humbling. They would completely want to shame them and discredit them. And that's exactly what they did. And we see that in that total humiliation, it was always done in a very public way, so that message would go on to others, and they would know. We see also in verse 8, as we look, it mentions another city. It mentions Thebes. So let's read from verse 8 as we continue. "Are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile, with water around her, her rampart a sea, and water her wall? Cush was her strength, Egypt too, and that without limit put, and the Libyans were her helpers." And we see in verse 8 that Thebes was another city that was a very, very strong, vibrant city, also known for its warring tribes and who it could conquer and what it could conquer. But that city itself came to be conquered, but it was actually rebuilt, and then it was reconquered again later on by the Romans. But in a sense, what will happen is that when Nineveh goes, it won't even be rebuilt. It will be completely annihilated, and it will be known no more. So it's judgment that is coming upon them, and it's remarkable that our world itself is no stranger to some of the sins and all of the sins that we look at that Nineveh were involved in. There's many I've not mentioned because of the sake of time and brevity and everything, but when the time comes and God has had enough and he calls it out and it's up, God will say that is enough, and he's saying that now. Judgment then will become inescapable. And we know ourselves as believers, and I believe we're all believers here, that today is the day of our salvation. We would know that and say that to people when they hear the word. But for those who know God, we know that he is good. You can read about God's goodness, and that in Jeremiah 3:11, we won't turn there now, and 2 Timothy 2:19, because of, as I say, the pagan worship and where it takes people. We spoke earlier about God is that jealous God, and we see it as is mentioned as prostitution, as whoring, as going after. Some people reverted back to paganism and going back to what they once believed, which is incredible. But we see that no one, as I say, thought Thebes itself, at that city at that time, would ever fall. But it did, and it didn't only fall once, it fell twice. And that, the second time it fell was just before the time that Nahum wrote this book. So the difference being that Nineveh itself would never be rebuilt. We'll continue verse 11. You also will be drunken. You will go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. All the fortresses are like fig trees with first ripe figs. If shaken, they will fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, your troops are women in your midst. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. Draw water from the siege. Strengthen your forts. Go into the clay. Tread the mortar. Take hold of the brick and mold. There will be fire. There will the fire devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust. Multiply like the grasshopper. You increased your merchants more than stars of heaven. The locust spread its wings and flies away. Your princes are like grasshoppers. Your scribes like clouds of locusts settling on fences. In a day of cold, when the sun rises, they flee away. No one knows where they are. So all the dignitaries and all the people of power and all those who were involved in that city, great and small, but particularly those leaders, would just disappear, would blow away like locusts. It's all really interesting sort of detail and imagery in this book when you study it for yourself, and they themselves would be completely destroyed. So we see that when the shepherds slumber here, as we read verse 18 and just finish up in chapter 3, your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for all upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. So all those they have committed evil on will be gloating when they see them receiving their evil in those days, and that comeuppance, as it were, because those overseers for them who have slumbered, who were not alert, who were not watchful like shepherds, they won't be able to save their flock from any danger, unlike the Lord Jesus. We are his flock and he is our shepherd. It's a totally different thing here. All who heard her, every nation who suffered under her heinous crimes, her abusive powers, would shout and clap and rejoice as she would be completely destroyed and completely taken out. So as we see the end of that book, it's a pretty gloomy book in many ways, but we can read very many upbeat scriptures. I think as believers, what we can take from it is we're not on that side. We don't want to be on that side, but we also see that God completely will protect his own, will protect his faithful, and he will punish the arrogant and the proud and all of his enemies. That goes without saying. Today, Nineveh is just a desert. It's a great place. I think his contemporaries at the time were the prophet Zephaniah and a very young Jeremiah. But Zephaniah had also prophesied that it would be a place of jackals and hedgehogs and wild animals. It would just be bush and grown over. And it was only the wild beasts, he said, would inhabit that city of Nineveh as it was brought to ruin, as I say, predicted by Zephaniah. But it was lost for centuries, but found, would you believe, by an Englishman called Layard in 1820 on the west bank of the river Tigris, which is modern-day Iraq. And of course, the nation that came and overtook them to the right there, the Babylonians would have been from Persia, which is modern-day Iran. But we see, when we look at that and how Nineveh is gone and remembered no more, it reminded me of Capernaum. Now, Capernaum, what is interesting, we looked into it, Capernaum is a place where Jesus based himself. He lived a lot of his life. He called a lot of the disciples in and around that area. Peter's mother-in-law was healed there, the paralytic. There was many things that happened and said by Jesus in that town of Capernaum, which was a town in Galilee. It was actually named after Nahum the prophet. Caper or Capur means village, and Nahum, the way it's spelled, is Nahum, and it was to remember him as a prophet. But actually, Jesus in Matthew 11, 22, 23, if we just turn there quickly, if you can turn to Matthew, it's just worth a quick look before we finish up. So we see, and Jesus is speaking here, verse 23 in chapter 11, Matthew. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be no more tolerable in the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. So Jesus actually throws a curse upon them because they refused him and denied him, and he went from them. And again, it's interesting, that's another place that lies in rubble to this day when it was taken out. You can go to a place right next to it, but the rubble itself, it still stands as a monument to the rejection of Jesus in a place that he based himself and spent so much, and they would have been so privileged to have heard him speak and his word many, many times, but ultimately they rejected Jesus. And we know, or many of us know, the unpardonable sin is to reject Christ. And it's something that it's more somber message, but in many ways, with the days we were living in, as I said before, there's much conversation. Speaking to a few Christians now online as well, who are there's all sorts of things. We know that Russia and Gog and Magog is mentioned in end times and eschatology. We could spend a lot of time with that. We may agree or we may disagree on certain things, but ultimately God has all this in control. He knows what's happening there, and with China, his hand is upon it. We don't need to fear. We just need to look up, and we need to keep our faith strong in him, and tell people about Jesus while we can, because the days are short. We don't know how long, but we should, live as though his return is any time, because he could be any time.